India is a large country with an ever-growing economy and industries that are progressing every day to cater to 1.3 billion population. These industries form the backbone of the nation, making India one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In the power sector, India Power Corporation Limited has been doing just that, steadily and with determination, adding power to the lives of people for the last 100 years. The journey began in 1919 when the then largest coal producer in Asia, the Bengal Coal Company Limited, needed a solution to its massive power requirements. The Chhattisgarh Power Supply Corporation Limited was set up in Asansol to meet their needs. It was awarded a distribution license in 1932 and it became DPSC Limited in 2003. In 2008, it developed a 2 megawatt solar power plant at Shibpur, a first of its kind grid connector solar plant in Asia. On a roll now, in 2013, the name DPSC Limited changed to IPCL or India Power Corporation Limited. And that is how India and the world knows us today. In 2014, IPCL commenced power distribution in Gaya as a distribution franchisee and continued for 4 years with benchmarked performance in such a short period, achieving loss reduction trajectory supply reliability of over 95% and deployment of smart metering technology, being much ahead of others and having the highest performance in its kind of distribution model. Another ace that we have up our sleeves is the implementation of SCADA, a revolutionary mechanism. It is installed at the J.K. Nagar substation, which acts as the central conduit for real-time monitoring and control over quality output and consumer feedback using automated meter reading technology along with automated digitized payment options. J.K. Nagar also houses India Power's Area Load Dispatch Center, which is the nerve center for the operation, planning, monitoring and control of the power system, ensuring India Power to achieve maximum security and efficiency, providing uninterrupted power supply to its consumers. The distribution portfolio also saw an addition with India Power acquiring distribution license for the SEZ region of Tuticorin, spread across an area of approximately 2,518 acres. In 2019, India Power is completing its centenary year as a leading holistic integrated power utility in the country.
We are proud to be celebrating India Power's 100th year in 2019. We are a unique company with a rich legacy of a 100-year-old, century-old organization, as well as the dynamism of a very young and futuristic utility. We are one of the first distribution companies who have implemented 100% automated metering infrastructure and implement SCADA and other technologies, which is helping our customers consume electricity more efficiently and making our network more reliable.
India Power today is an integrated holistic power company with foothold in different segments. With regards to India Power's exceptional operational efficiency, a special mention is imperative for its operation in the Asansol and Raniganj area. Despite being in a competitive market, the power distribution scenario is different from the rest. It has the lowest T&D losses of about 3% only. Its supply reliability is rated at 99.99%. distinguished by its customer-centric programs and digitization.
I am very happy to satisfy with the services and all the service rendered by the corporation.
Quick response team, that is maintenance team during emergency, stormy weather, they are giving full support to us and we are happy with the IPCL authority.
The quality of power is very good. And the frequency is also very low, the power cut frequency, the fluctuations are not there.
जो भी स्टाफ है, सर्विस है, सबसे बेस्ट सर्विस है। प्रोडक्शन के लिए हमें लाइन की पावर की बहुत आवश्यकता होती है, जो कि आपके यहाँ बहुत अच्छी व्यवस्था है। कुछ प्रॉब्लम होने से विदिन एन आवर ये प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व की जाती है।
We are getting a very good service, very good support. I advise to all the industries or promoter or any other domestic use or commercial use, go for India Power.
A 100-year journey is no easy feat, so
Thank you. So we have with us Mr. Anirban Ghosh, Chief Sustainability Officer, Mahindra Group, and Ms. Sara Doby, Manager, Resilience Programs, Climate Resilience Consulting. So I would request Ms. Doby to please address us first. She will be speaking on green bonds, carbon market, insurance date for nature swaps.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to go first. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm honored that you reached out to us to give a talk on climate finance and focusing on carbon dynamic or the carbon market dynamics and so on. So I'm going to focus today on growing India's finance and funding for climate change, looking at barriers and opportunities. So first off, I like to just kind of clarify climate change mitigation versus resilience whenever I give a talk. I know most of the folks here are probably focused on mitigation, but at CRC, we focus a lot on resilience. And so whenever we talk about financing climate mitigation, we also like to talk about financing resilience. So as most of you already know, actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions generally fall into the category of climate change mitigation. So this might be renewable energy, sustainable transportation, and so on. Whereas climate adaptation or resilience refers to actions that build capacity to respond to, cope with, adapt to, and transform from climate change. So this might be flood-proofing buildings or putting up structures to help block sea level rise or restoring nature to try to help buffer against nearshore flooding and so on. And so since we recognize now that climate change is inevitable, no matter what, we're going to experience some degree of warming and some degree of increases in disasters, we generally like to focus on kind of that synergy between mitigation and resilience. And so with that being said, I'm now going to go into some of the information we have around the state of climate finance and barriers for India for growing their climate finance. And then after that, I'll go into some opportunities based on our work in the US and that we think also holds great promise for India. So currently, internationally, global finance flows have grown from around 342 billion USD to around 546 billion USD over the course of 2013 to 2018. So we're seeing a very significant growth in the level of investment in both mitigation and resilience, although the financing for climate mitigation is significantly higher. And for the climate resilience finance needs, there's around a $3 trillion gap that's needed by 2050 across the world. And there's been a lot of research that suggests that there's significant economic benefits when you also invest in resilience. So around $1.8 trillion in investments in resilience would yield $7.1 trillion in avoided costs and in benefits as well. So for an investment in resilience and adaptation, we're also going to see a lot of benefits for the economy and for communities' well-being. And before the COVID crisis, global investment reached $30 billion annually in climate resilience. So it's definitely growing, but there's still a significant gap. And it's estimated that the private sector could be critical for closing this gap. And in India, there's been some more momentum in recent years around climate finance, but there's still a large gap and a need to scale up the level of finance and funding in India. So studies have estimated that India will need $2.5 trillion or $170 billion per year for climate action between 2015 and 2030. But green finance flows are only around 1/10 of this. They've been around $17 billion per year in 2017 and $21 billion in 2018. And so this is definitely a very significant amount of money. And as a whole, the country has done a good job at really mobilizing investments, but there's still a long way to go. And to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, there's also a need to invest a similar level of funding. Of course, that overlaps a lot with the climate action funding. So the World Bank estimates that unchecked climate change could affect the lives of over half of the country's population. So investing in resilience in addition to mitigation is very important. 3/4 of India's 700 or more districts are going to be affected by these events. And a report by McKinsey and Company estimates that 2.5 to 4.5% of India's annual GDP could be at risk from climate change. And so really finding these opportunities to invest in mitigation and resilience is very important for protecting India's economic stability and well-being. And overall, India's climate finance flows so far have focused heavily on mitigation. I don't know if you can see, but there's just like these very little slivers right here that actually fall into the adaptation realm. And most of the climate funds so far have come from the UNFCCC finance mechanisms, bilateral sources, and multilateral banks. So generally, when we talk about closing the climate finance gap for both mitigation and resilience, there's been a growing focus on the role of the private sector and seeking out partnerships between the public sector, the governments, the state, local, federal governments, and the private sector. So India actually has a very successful history of public-private partnerships to date, and they've been able to leverage a lot of these funds for financing infrastructure. And so there's probably some momentum that could be built off here for financing climate action, especially for resilience. And there's a lot of benefits when seeking out these partnerships. So they allow for the exchange of knowledge, capacity building, and sharing risk. And mitigation projects are often tied to revenue streams. So making the case to bring the private sector in to invest is usually pretty straightforward. It's clear that there's benefits in terms of cost savings, but when we think about resilience, they may require additional incentives to attract investment. And so those will be some of the pieces that we focus on today, are some of those mechanisms that might be able to incentivize investment in resilience, but also in mitigation for the private sector, as well as opportunities where you might be able to see collaboration between the public and private sectors for finance. And currently, there are several barriers to investment in India, especially when we think about resilient infrastructure. So there's a lack of regulatory frameworks to support some of these initiatives. There isn't necessarily always a clear cut benefit or a case that's been made for investing in resilience. And so there needs to be, like I mentioned, some kind of incentives and maybe changes to regulatory policies to support some of these approaches. But a lot of studies and reports by institutions have suggested that a lot of the mechanisms that we've seen success with in the US would also work well in India. So now jumping into some of these opportunities for growing money for climate finance in the public and private sectors. First off are green bonds. So for those of you who are not familiar, green bonds are a type of fixed income instrument or a bond used for climate related and environmental projects. They often require third-party verification by the Climate Bonds Initiative. So they have a scheme where people can basically assess their bonds, like the structure and design of them, against certain criteria in order to verify that they will have the intended benefits. So considering things like doing no harm to communities and avoiding maladaptation, so increasing the vulnerability of populations to climate change through investments, would be considered maladaptive. And so really it's intended to make sure that you're accomplishing the environmental outcomes that you're seeking to accomplish through your investment without causing any harm, like I mentioned. And the Climate Bonds Initiative has started to require investments to demonstrate resilience, even when they're mitigation investments. So again, looking for those synergistic opportunities to invest in mitigation and resilience are in most people's best interest. And as of 2021, India has the second largest emerging green bond market after China. And so this is a type of finance and funding mechanism that we expect to really be taking off in the coming years. And they have been issued by all sorts of different parties. So there are sovereign governments at the federal level. There's also local governments who have worked with banks to issue bonds, as well as the non-financial sector private sector that have issued bonds, as well as the private, or as well as the finance sector. So there's a lot of different entities that have started to implement these bonds globally. And again, in India, there's been a lot of momentum around green bonds. So it's likely that this will become a more common way for both the private and the public sector to finance climate mitigation as well as resilience. Next are environmental impact bonds. They're a type of debt vehicle that are linked to bond performance. And so impact bonds have been used in India for social impact projects and development impact projects a lot to date. Less so for the environmental impact, but the bonds are emerging as a good way to foster relationships with the public and private sectors. They're encouraging more socially responsible investments, and they're driving progress in attaining the sustainable development goals. And so, once again, like the green bonds, environmental impact bonds are seeking to achieve certain environmental outcomes. However, they have to actually set performance objectives that if they meet, they get better returns on their investment. So the performance of the project actually determines the interest rate. So it can affect the profitability of the bond. And this is growing in popularity, especially we've seen in the US with financing climate mitigation as well as resilience, because there's incentive to do better, because the better that your project performs, the better that you get the payouts from the bond. And so it's seen as a really strong instrument for motivating the private sector to participate. And then debt for nature swaps have also become more popular, especially in less developed countries. So basically how these work is that a government, generally at the country level, can exchange some of its debt in order to pay for environmental conservation. So the issuer of the bond or the creditor might actually forgive debt if the country says that they will pay for certain conservation efforts. And so it's a way that countries can help to free up some of their existing finance flows in order to pay for climate mitigation or resilience. And right now is a very opportune time because there's a lot of issues that countries are having with paying for their debt, and they're at risk for defaulting on their debt as a result of COVID-19. And so you might have creditors who are getting kind of nervous and antsy about whether or not countries are able to actually pay back their debt. And so there may be an opportunity to kind of act on that and to redirect some of the existing finance flows towards these mitigation and resilience efforts. This approach has not really been explored in the private sector or as much at the sub-country level, but it certainly would make sense that it might become an instrument in the private sector as well. But again, to date, it's been more country-level governments. Next are private equity funds, and these have become a lot more popular in the last 2 years. So private equity funds are essentially venture capital funds that investors will pay into, and they're often associated with a large suite of projects. And we've seen a large shift so far in the market internationally from focusing on investing in equity funds for conventional energy fuels to more renewable energy fuels. So there's definitely been a shift in this direction already. And this is another way that could be good to attract private sector investment into mitigation and resilience projects. It's becoming more common also for resilience-related projects. So Pollination, a company located in the US, and HSBC started I think it was a $1 billion natural capital fund to pay for conservation projects in order to help countries to build resilience to climate change. So this is also a growing instrument in terms of the resilience sector as well. And India is ranked among the top 3 countries most attractive for emerging market destinations for these sort of investments. And so this might be another area ripe with opportunity. Next, carbon markets and carbon offsets are another growing area being used to pay for not only climate mitigation, but also resilience. And so India is currently one of the largest beneficiaries of the total world carbon trade, making up 31% the clean development mechanism. India's carbon market is also one of the fastest growing carbon markets in the world, and has generated around 30 million carbon credits. And this is growing faster than technology, biotechnology, and BPO sectors in India. So again, this is gaining a lot of momentum. And there's an opportunity to capitalize on these investments also to pay for resilience, especially when we start thinking about blue carbon, which is an emerging type of carbon offset. So generally, when we think about carbon offsets, we're talking about maybe investing in forestry or reforestation to help reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of terrestrial activities. But we can also restore coastal habitats that will sequester carbon, like seagrass, salt marshes, and mangroves. And a co-benefit of this is that mangroves especially are very good at buffering storm surges. And they can significantly reduce the damage from high energy waves during these storms and help to reduce flooding as well. And so we're starting to see a growth, especially in coastal areas, for blue carbon ecosystems. And one of the great things about carbon markets and carbon offsets is that it's taking a good that usually isn't associated with any form of revenues, and it's creating a cost benefit for companies. So instead of investing in a project and just having these intangible benefits, a lot of companies are able to start claiming these carbon credits towards their sustainability reporting as they try to go net zero. And so this is one of the ways in which countries and local governments and the private sector have really worked to increase those public-private partnerships, is through these sort of investments. And lastly, parametric insurance is another emerging approach for paying for climate mitigation and adaptation. So parametric insurance is a type of insurance that pays out at different thresholds. So let's say there's a storm that has a wind speed exceeding 100 knots or 200 knots. That would then trigger a payout for the insurance policy. So instead of filing a claim after a disaster, there are certain triggers that trigger the automatic payout, and it can be within days opposed to within months or a year or two. And so the way that these generally work is they operate more like a fund. So it's highly reliant on the public and the private sector partnering on instituting this policy. So the private sector, let's say hotels in the case that's shown here in the picture, might pay the municipal government to help restore the ecosystem like coral reefs, which help to reduce damages during extreme weather events like coastal storms. And this money, like I said, would go towards restoring that, but also it would pay into a parametric insurance policy. And when an event occurs, it would trigger the community to pay out and pay for repairs and reconstruction for the hotels who paid into the policy, as well as for the coral reef. And the idea is that it's getting companies to help pay for resilience or mitigation projects for the community before the disaster, and kind of creating more co-ownership over the payment approach. This has been used in Quintana Roo, Mexico, and currently it's being considered in Hawaii and Florida. But this is still a very new type of climate finance mechanism. And so there's a lot of risk associated with being an early actor. But companies like Willis Towers Watson have done a lot of work to investigate the regulatory frameworks that would be needed, as well as approaches to kind of engaging these different actors in developing this sort of policy. And so it's likely that this will become a lot more common in the next few years. And in India, this could hold a lot of promise based on some of our conversations at Climate Resilience Consulting with some of the companies in India through a virtual trade mission we participated in. It sounds like the extraction industry in India is located largely along the coast. And so it would be possible to leverage this sort of partnership maybe to ensure some natural capital along the coast in order to pay for carbon sequestration as well as resilience. So just wrapping up, I wanted to just kind of give a quick overview just about our firm. So there's two of us basically that are leading most of the work for the firm. So there's Joyce Coffey, who's not with us today, who's the president and founder of Climate Resilience Consulting. She's worked in the climate mitigation and resilience sector for around 25 years now. And I'm the manager of the climate resilience programs. And so we do a lot of work on sustainability analysis and research, performance evaluation and reporting, strategic planning and management. And a lot of our work has been focused on climate strategies to mitigate climate change and build resilience, how to finance resilience, and how to measure it. And then just a quick overview, we have clients and partners both in the US and around the world. And that is all. So I'm happy to field any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have Mr. Gautam Ray, Chairperson, Energy and Environment Committee, and the Vice President of the Chamber, who is also Executive Director, CESA Limited. So Mr. Ray would be moderating the questions, but before that, we would request our next speaker, Mr. Anirban Ghosh, Chief Sustainability Officer of Mahindra. And I would like to quote a headline which featured in the media earlier this month, that Mahindra Group to quantify its social impact as ESG and impact investing impact investing as which is now gaining currency globally. With this, I would request Mr. Ghosh to please share his thoughts, following which we'll get into the interactive session.
Thank you, Angana. We just heard a wonderful presentation from Sarah in a great deal of detail on the subject of climate finance. From the presentation, it was clear that climate needs a lot of money, that some money is flowing, but a lot more is required. That the money can go into mitigation or adaptation. And all of us who have participated in conversations on green finance, we've always talked about the $100 billion Green Climate Fund and how that money was not flowing. So obviously it is worth asking the question that why aren't the promised monies flowing, and why isn't the private sector spending more in this area? Actually, the answer is very obvious. It's something we face every day. Money flows when it makes economic sense. As it makes more and more economic sense to invest in climate, the flow of money increases, which is probably why in areas like renewable energy, in green transportation, in electric storage, in energy storage, we can see significant investments happening because they are either already economically feasible or are well on their way to becoming economically feasible. There's also another pattern. Investments in mitigation give very good returns. So one can expect a lot of private sector finance in the mitigation space. But investments in adaptation typically don't give great economic returns. Those investments are required for the safety of human beings around the space where the investments are being made. So these investments typically can be expected to come from the public sector and over time from insurance organizations as the spread of insurance increases to cover adaptation activities. Interestingly, most mitigation investments are not completely additive to the economy. What I mean by that is if you're investing in renewable energy, it is probably at the cost of investing in, let's say, thermal energy or some other form of energy. If you're investing in clean transportation, if you had not invested in clean transportation, you would have invested in some other form of transportation. There may be an incremental increase and there may not be. But in the case of adaptation, however, the entire investment is GDP accretive. It's a completely new form of investment which did not exist before. So if a nation has to make a push for growth in its economy, it should, in addition to mitigation, definitely focus on adaptation. Now, Sarah mentioned a large number of different forms of finance that is possible in this space. So let's look at them in some sort of detail. Let's take green bonds first. They've been around for some time. They're reasonably large, but they don't seem to catch fire. Well, I can share my perspective with you on why, let's say, the Mahindra Group has neither issued nor subscribed to green bonds. The challenge with green bonds is that there is no benefit in terms of the interest rate that you get on the bond. And while there is no benefit on the interest rate, there is also a stipulation that you can only use it for certain kinds of things. So if you have borrowed $100 million and you don't have green projects to invest these $100 million in, you'll be stuck with the money, you will be paying out interest, but the money will not be giving you any returns at all. So only when there is a large project available and you need money for it, you can go in for a green bond, though it does not give you any financial benefit whatsoever, at least not from any of the bonds that I have come across so far. However, there is a new kind of financing instrument which is very interesting. It is just developing. We've heard of a few transactions that have happened, some of them in India, and they are linked, the interest rate is linked to sustainability performance. The lender says that here is some money, you can use this money in your business, there is no stipulation on what you can do with the money. Here is an interest rate, which is the normal interest rate that you will pay me for the money. But if you achieve certain agreed sustainability goals, you will get a haircut on this interest rate. Now, this makes a lot of sense because not only does it promote the economic growth of the company, it also ensures that the company meets pre-agreed sustainability goals. So the money lent actually enables the cause of the climate, and therefore is a very interesting form of climate finance, which one hopes will grow over time. In fact, using this money, one can actually invest into climate technologies which enable mitigation and in some cases adaptation as well. As the chart, the wonderful chart that Sarah shared on mitigation, adaptation, and projects which overlap mitigation and adaptation. That was wonderfully presented and that clarity is greatly appreciated. But that Venn diagram also made another thing very clear, that sustainability linked finances are best used for projects which have both a planet benefit and a profit benefit. Now, when these two overlap and you make an investment into projects that are in the overlap of planet and profit, we make simultaneously an economic impact as well as a climate impact. And whenever that happens, it is possible to scale. And that is why the belief that these sustainability linked bonds will actually will gather steam and will grow in much faster than most other forms of climate finance. Then there is the conversation on carbon credits, which actually was very large when the clean development mechanism was in place. There's not much happening in the clean development mechanism space. Article 6 in the Paris Accord has still not got worked out, and it covers all these areas. But right now, there is a very big conversation building on voluntary carbon markets. And the assumption is exactly as how Sarah put it, that organizations who wish to become carbon neutral will not be able to eliminate all their emissions. They will need to offset residual emissions, and a way of offsetting residual emissions are carbon credits. Now, everyone can't generate carbon credits on their own, so there will be a third party who will generate carbon credits. And if you have to buy those credits from the third party, there will obviously be some money involved, and that will then go to finance more and more, a generation of more and more carbon credits. In principle, it's a great idea. But as I participate in these conversations on voluntary carbon markets, a few things become very clear. For one, the cost of the credits are likely to become very high in the period 2030 to 2040, when most companies have said that they will become carbon neutral. And when I say very high, I'm talking of numbers in excess of $100 per credit, and I don't know how much higher it can go. And why is that high? Because organizations who wish to become carbon neutral will probably want to offset in excess of 1 million tons of carbon. So you can just imagine that to offset 1 million tons of carbon at $100 per carbon credit, you're looking at an investment of $100 million per year. That's a lot of money, even for the largest companies in the world. So if the ecosystem continues in this way, then one will have to reinvent the carbon credit ecosystem to make sure that it becomes a viable way to offset emissions and is also economically viable. Because if it is not economically viable, nobody is going to go and set up, do the afforestation projects or the mangrove projects or the very many other kinds of projects, whether they be nature-based or they be hybrid or they be technical, unless they are economically viable. So to my mind, the jury is still out on how the carbon credits market is going to take off. I know the ETS market works in Europe, but the value of, the values of carbon credit there on that market is much lower now. If it were to hit $100 plus, I wonder how that market is going to function. So we will have to see how this develops. But there are some realities which will always be there, that residual emissions will need to be offset. In fact, in some of the discussions, it almost seemed as if a big challenge is going to be on creating demand for credits. And the demand creation of credits may well happen through regulation, whereas the supply of credits may well happen by the private sector or by non-government organizations who have, done what is necessary to create the tradable carbon credits. Of course, another part of the conversation is to ensure that the quality of the carbon credits is great, that there is actually carbon removals associated with the mechanism by which these carbon credits have been generated, and that this is incremental and so on. So the whole conversation can get very complex, but going forward, there will be a need for carbon credits when not just companies but also nations start moving towards becoming carbon neutral. You may have also heard that there is this, a lot of ESG mutual funds have started developing. Well, this is more an instrument for investors, a way for investors to look at organizations which, because of their actions in the sustainability space, are likely to be more resilient and are therefore likely to be better investments. Which brings me to the perspective as to which stakeholder can expect to use or get what kind of funds. So if you're a company, as in a company like the one I work in, and you wanted money for mitigation projects, for investment either in energy efficiency or renewable energy, or even in businesses like clean transportation or green buildings or water recycling or whatever it may be, then the sources of funding can be conventional, can be public sector and so on. And if you were able to access funding which is sustainability linked, then you would get a little better interest rate. In fact, it would be wonderful if development sector funds could be made available to corporations, of course linked with very sharp reductions in emission, and they could well be associated with science-based targets. So if you look at the kind of emissions that a company has to reduce if it has to achieve science-based targets, let me take one or two examples from our group. So our automotive business has to reduce scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 47% if it has to achieve science-based targets by 2030. And it also has to reduce its scope 3 emissions by 30%. Now, these are very steep emission cuts, and these emission cuts will require investment. The good news is that these emission cuts will actually save the company a lot of money. Therefore, borrowing, if necessary, to implement the projects that will bring about these emission cuts could make sense if you could pay it back through the savings you were making. And for lenders, it could make sense to lend to these projects with a caveat at better interest rates, perhaps even development sector funds, with the caveat that these interest rates are only valid if you cut your emissions and achieve your science-based targets. And if you don't do so, then this money comes to you at regular market rates. If you happen to be an investor, yes, of course, you can look at things like ESG funds. You can even look at investing in businesses which are clean businesses and which are likely to be businesses for the future. This is probably where all the private equity money is going, and this is probably where all the new technologies are getting their money from. We know we need many, many more new technologies if we have to achieve the sharp cuts that are necessary to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And lastly, if you're an innovator, who could give you the money? If you're an innovator who's developing technologies, let's say you're developing a new kind of a storage battery, or you're developing flexible solar films, or you are getting clean hydrogen going, or you're getting biofuel going, all the things that we know we will need to halve emissions by 2030 and become net neutral by 2050. Well, no better place to go than private equity investors, impact investors, who are looking at spaces like this because they believe these are the growth businesses and growth technologies for the future. That is a perspective that I wanted to share with you in the place of green finance. I'm glad Sarah set up the conversation very, very nicely in explaining how lots of money is required. There are different ways in which you can get the money, but the money isn't completely flowing, not as much as it is required now. And through our conversation, I hope you've got a sense of why the money is not flowing, what can make it flow, who can get money from where, and what are the reasons why the money could be invested. We believe that in future, climate businesses will be areas for growth investments. And we also know many of the technologies which will be necessary in the future. It's time to move money in that direction. If it is not ready for private sector, maybe there should be public funds to get R&D going so that we reach a stage where private sector finance can then step in and make growth happen. Thank you very much for listening patiently to me.
Angoda,
yes, sir.
I convey my thanks to Sarah and Anirban for bringing the right context and points on the question of this funding, the issues of the green funds and how to really make it happen. While Sarah, in all the parameters of what are the available different type of structures are there and in which area such funds can be made available, while she explained in detail, Anirban has mentioned rightly that what are the possibilities of having those funds available and what are the impediments as well as where are the potentials. We also come to know that the fund is not a very small amount. We are speaking of a huge fund, and the strategic locations, for example, India being a country which we feel that, I mean, is a top 3 most attractive energy market, as Sarah has said rightly. Second, green bond market. So we are discussing the particular topic in a country, in an environment where it has got much of a relevance and context. We talked about the adaptation, mitigation, and leveraging the private sector. Vis-a-vis, we also discussed about the knowledge sharing, capability or capacity building, and risk sharing issues. So definitely this is something, unless we can bring some logical conclusion on it, and some of the menu or some of the packages which can meet the ends from different angle, without such resource availability, there might be much of a planning, there might be very ambitious plan, but it will be difficult to reach. There are some one or two questions came, which I would like you to respond. What are the learnings India may take from the efforts after Kyoto Protocol? Any of you can take it up, please. Anirban, can you?
You're on mute, sir. Yeah.
Yes, I was desperately trying to get my microphone going. Yeah, you know, it's a different world altogether from the time of the Kyoto Protocol. One of the big challenges that we are facing at the COP negotiations from an Indian perspective is how to revive the clean development mechanism in some form, because here in India we have a whole bunch of CDM projects which were in the pipeline and which would have normally got funded through the CDM mechanism had it been continued. However, and this is entirely my personal view, it seems to me, having listened to all sides in the conversation, that we possibly need a new way of looking at this problem of dealing with Article 6, perhaps even saying that, okay, CDM is over, let's forget about it, let's create something new, which is even better. Because the moment we get into CDM, we will also get into questions of, okay, so how good are those credits? And over time, we've learned a lot about how to make great credits happen. And therefore, going forward, keeping the fact that we are all trying to solve the climate problem, we probably should move forward and not worry too much about it. Now, I know this is not a popular view. I also know that our negotiators don't like this position at all. But that's why I said this is my perspective.
Thank you, Anirban. I have another question for Sarah. How valuable would be international engagements for India in terms of carbon credit market?
So, truthfully, I'm new to working with India. We just started this last month. But I think, like the US, there's probably going to be significant challenges with developing a reliable way to actually evaluate the amount of carbon sequestered and getting the regulatory frameworks in place. I think that it holds a lot of potential, though. It's just like any other policy, it's probably going to receive pushback. Especially, it's important to get the private sector's buy-in, because if you have large industries like the natural resource extraction industry in India, they might feel as though it's going to threaten their business if the focus is shifting to climate mitigation. But at the same time, at least in the US, a lot of the companies have started to realize in that industry that they will not be able to operate if they don't find a way to be more sustainable. So I think that it's probably going to be an uphill battle, but it holds a lot more potential. And maybe Anirban can talk a little bit more about the India specific. I'm sorry if that's not super useful. I more know about the mechanisms itself opposed to the financial context of India.
Mr. Ray, if I may, with your permission.
Right.
India has a choice. Actually, every country has a choice whether it wishes to be a buyer of carbon credits or a supplier of carbon credits. Now, depending on how large a nation you are and the geography and the topography, the question of whether you have the opportunity to be a provider or a seller of carbon credits can be answered. Now, India does have a huge opportunity in trying to become a seller of carbon credits and enable other corporations and countries to become carbon neutral. But while I say that, I am also acutely aware of a few things. We have to do a lot of offsetting ourselves, given the fact that we are unlikely to move away from coal-powered energy in the near future. So whether we become a seller or not is intricately linked to our transition from thermal energy to renewable energy. The second thing that we have to keep in mind is, given the rapid pace of development, I don't think we are actually adding to our wealth of nature-based solutions. I know official numbers say that afforestation, or the amount of land covered by forests, is actually gone up. But if you go a little deeper into that, you will find that the quantum of newly grown trees, or I think it even covers croplands, is way too high and increasing too quickly. So we are losing very, very good forests, and we are losing very, very good nature-based solutions which can absorb carbon in exchange for things which have far less power to absorb carbon. So these are things we have to keep in mind. Our opportunity exists. We would be better off becoming a supplier than buyer. And I do hope, and I know that these apprehensions are there in the mind of the government, which is why, while many governments have gone ahead and said we'll become net neutral, we haven't yet said so. Because only to keep our Paris promise of 2.5 billion to 3 billion tons of incremental carbon sink, we'll probably have to plant in excess of 50 million trees. And that's a lot of incremental trees to plant.
Yeah. In fact, one very interesting question came. Both of you have spoken about the need, the potential for the green finance. Are there any drawback of carbon credit market which are to be concerned about in the long run?
I don't know. What do you think, Sarah? Are there any drawbacks to a carbon credit market?
Any flip side of it?
I guess so I've worked in corporate sustainability most of my career so far. And I think one concern that we always had with taking the carbon credit approach was that it kind of allows people to continue to pollute and maybe emit greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the same goes for when you're talking about like water quality or scarcity project credits too. So one classic example, I won't name the company, but there's a company I worked for that was doing a lot of manufacturing in a country that was running out of water, in an area that was running out of water. And they were aware that there was only 15 to 20 years of water left. And yet they were still continuing to expand operations. And they were claiming that they were improving and, oh, we're water conscious, we can come out kind of water neutral or close to it because they were doing watershed restoration projects. But really, they were continuing to operate the same way and continuing to expand their operations. So in a way, it can kind of, first off, it's a Band-Aid fix most of the time, right? Carbon credits are great in a lot of ways, and yes, you are sequestering carbon, but it doesn't mean that the company is changing how they operate. And it might just allow them to continue to emit without actually changing over to a sustainable approach in the long term. So that's my only hesitation when we start thinking about carbon markets and offsets, is that ultimately it's probably not addressing the root cause of the problem. And that's what we need to do in order for long-term sustainability. But it can be a good way to at least kind of balance out the emissions in the interim.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, the last question I would like to, ask any of you. Can a country be evaluated by ESG? ESG, on the question of investment decision. Is there any such type of, standards or something like this?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but I don't think there is a standard. But should there be a standard at all? If you are putting your money into the country, I guess what you would want is a lower country risk. So far, when we've looked at country risk, we've essentially looked at things like political risk, we've looked at social risk, we've looked at the risk of contracts not being honored or a justice system not being present, things like that. I think it's fair to look at climate disaster risks going forward, because maybe climate disasters will affect some geographies more than they will affect others. I think that expectation is fairly valid. So while there is no framework here today, from a ESG perspective, if you were investing in a particular country, any country for that matter, or any region of a country, then factoring in the probabilities or the likelihoods of climate disaster, I suppose is an additional parameter that we must use today.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, I think at the country level, a lot of countries are reporting along with in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's probably going to be more comprehensive than ESG. But I definitely see the value, and I'm trying to pull up. So our team actually has an approach that we use to ESG that incorporates resilience. So certainly, I think you could still use those criteria, but I'm not sure it would make the most sense. So just to kind of show, this is how we approach doing ESG and resilience. And so we have a service mark on R. So we like to refer to ESG and R. And the companies that we work with, we've increasingly been encouraging to consider resilience as an additional component as its ESG programs, rather than just nesting it in, because it's probably just as important as these other pieces. But I could also see the value in it, because a lot of credit rating agencies have started to incorporate sustainability into resilience, into how they're providing credit ratings like Moody's and so on. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe eventually there was a shift as we started to see more kind of public-private partnerships. But like Anirban said, I don't know that it will make as much sense, because we have such strong frameworks from a sustainability perspective, like the Sustainable Development Goals. But there is definitely a need probably for more resilience measurement on top of that. I don't know if that helps. But
Sarah, if you don't mind leaving that chart on for a little while. In fact, once again, your chart makes things very clear. What you've got in social and governance is what risk organizations actually look at when they are assessing country risk today. This is a part of their framework. There is more, but this is a part of their framework. If you look at all the things which are listed under E, the problems associated with those threaten resilience.
mm-hmm.
And you've got everything written under R, which enhances resilience. And this is why the thought that occurred to me is, in addition to whatever we look at for country risk, which is covered in most part by what you've got under SNG, one has to also look at the possibility of climate disaster, and that's what you've got under R. So just like your Venn diagram, thank you very much. Your diagram helped explain the point once again.
By Anirban, this you started with E and ultimately plus R. It speaks, I mean, it is a very bringing large degree of clarity in the entire process. So we are almost at the close of the session. Thanks again from Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry to Anirban and Sara. And you have basically all of entire discussion has been centering around the green investment, its potential, its structure, its possibilities, its risk. One thing I was thinking at the time when listening to both of you, that while it is true that the investment, any investment has to have a return, and one has to see it very clearly before taking that investment decision, but that decision may not be immediate. That return may not be immediate. That may not be that now. Bringing the futuristic vision in mind, because sometimes from now, I am speaking for the industry also, if they see that the very existence will be at stake, so we may have to go in for some similar investment which may give me the sustainability in the long run. You have spoken about whether some form of regulation or completely it will be market driven. So that balance also we have to do. And of course, return on investment vis-a-vis the social obligation. And another very important aspect came into picture is the technology. Because some of the time we see that the technology brings such a disruptive change that it helps either way. And Anirban has mentioned about, I like the way you have told that we are now going through a transition management phase. So now it is no more a discussion that whether it is possible or not. No more it is a discussion whether it has got a realistic value or not. Now the discussion is going on, we have to reach there, but how to do it. So I mean it is a surely the whole world, country, city, every organization is thinking of that transition management phase. Bengal Chamber also for quite a long, since a few years, we have been continuously working on the sustainability agenda. Recently, we have organized one very good such deliberations on ESG, and we are preparing also the whole. One of the purpose of this 2-day energy and environment conclave is to find out recommendations or suggestions in the form of it for the COP26. So entire 2-day we had various sessions centering around the sustainability. Many eminent speakers have participated in various sessions, and there have been participations from. It has been truly an international conference because of the participation of almost many countries worldwide. So in that way, we have got lot of thoughts and lot of inputs to frame some of the recommendations and some of the suggestions for COP26. So with this, I would like to conclude this session and would like Angana to close the entire deliberation of these 2 days conference on energy and environment conclave, which is a signature event and a flagship event of the chamber. Angana, please.
Thank you, sir, and thanks to Mr. Ghosh and Ms. Sara Dopey. It was a very fascinating session for us as organizers. Also, as Mr. Ray mentioned, that we are working in this space for quite some time, and the dynamics of carbon credit market, ESG, green funding. These are some of the newer dynamics, or the dynamics which are gaining more importance these days. We are focusing on these issues to add value to our members and stakeholders. And coming to this year's conclave, the theme is Journey Towards Net Zero, and we tried to curate the program in a manner that this journey towards net zero is approached by various ways. So, we tried to incorporate various kind of session, starting from engaging with children, say from class 1, 4, and 7, on how they think about their green planet, to, climate resilience for our landscape, vulnerable landscapes, and of course this session, cleaner fuels like natural gas and renewable transitions and business for tomorrow. So we had various kinds of sessions. So I believe that this is an effort from the Bengal Chamber to engage various stakeholders, government, think tanks, of course business, to think about, to collaborate and engage in journey towards net zero. So my special thanks to this session's speakers, Mr. Ghosh and Ms. Sara Dobi, and also to all the other speakers who have been with us for these 2 days. I'm not mentioning separately about Mr. Ray from the Bengal Chamber because he represents Bengal Chamber, but from individuals, on behalf of individually from me and Shujishmita, my colleague, thank you for your guidance and support, for helping us to put up this show. And we have Mr. Arun Mukherjee also here for your mentoring always. So with this, we would conclude this year's conclave. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning and good night.